The primary topic of this video is being able to differentiate between a scholarly and a popular source. It may be easiest just to start here at the ending. A scholarly source is a source written by scholars for other scholars to further a scholarly discussion or inquiry in any particular academic or scholarly domain or discipline. So if I could scroll back up to our rhetoric notes, if you take that definition and take it back to the basics of rhetoric, you'll see that at every stage of the rhetorical triangle, it has to be scholarly to call it a scholarly source. So the author, a scholarly author, must be writing for an audience of his or her peers, bringing in new information to further inquiry in a scholarly or academic setting. So, if I were let's just say a Shakespeare scholar, then I would be trying to get a paper published in some academic literary journal, let's just say Shakespeare Quarterly, and the editors of that particular journal would likely be people with PhDs in literature of that day, and probably specifically Shakespeare. And so these people had probably given their lives to learn more and to bring in fresh new ideas and to think and write and talk about and appreciate Shakespeare's literature. So these are the people who I want their stamp of approval if I am a young PhD in literature with a focus on Shakespeare. So I'm writing papers trying to say new and interesting things about this very, very old writing, but I'm sending my paper and my thoughts out to journals like Shakespeare Quarterly, and hopefully I will get the stamp of approval of these people who say, yes, that's a very interesting thing, and now your paper can be published in our journal, and now it'll be searchable, and everyone can see that that you have sort of affixed your name and your impression on this particular body of knowledge and inquiry in the academic world. And of course, in different disciplines, in the sciences, whether natural or social, I'm sure that the process is similar but has plenty of differences as well. But anyway, so if we can take it back to those basic rhetorical principles, then I think that's first and foremost how we determine whether a source is scholarly or not. So if you think of it this way, if we're talking about, let's just say, a famous scientist, let's say Stephen Hawking, and he's written a book for the masses, something like A Brief History of Space and Time, or something like that. I can't remember the name of his book. But that book, though Stephen Hawking is a scholar and a very intelligent man, he has written this book not for other scholars, but for all of us, so we can gain from his expertise and his research and knowledge. And so it's important that scholars can write for a non-scholarly audience. So anyway, but that book is not technically a scholarly source because it isn't written with other scholars in mind. It's written for all of us. So this is a little handout that kind of gives you some basics and helps you work through various indicators to determine whether or not you are reading a scholarly or popular source. So I'm going to start with these with these indicators, and let's just take a look at how they're different. With a scholarly source, your author is a scholar, but in a popular source, it could be just about anybody. And therein lies part of the problem, but credibility could be all over the place in a popular source. Now, with our audience, With a scholarly source, the audience is other scholars and, of course, students who are finding these sources and finding them useful in the types of papers that they are writing in academia in college. With a popular source, the audience could be, it's for all of us, it's for everyone. But, different publications have different types of audiences in mind. And, they say that the audience for a typical local newspaper, it should be written at an 8th grade reading level. And if you think about it, that's kind of important, because you want people to have access to the information about what's happening in their vicinity, regardless of how educated they are. It's a sort of a very democratic thing that we could all have access to the news and know what's happening in the world around us, and that it would be accessible to more people than less. The purpose of a scholarly source, of course, is to further scholarship or some scholarly discussion within a particular academic field. But in a popular source, in a popular source, it's more often than not to entertain us or to make us feel a certain way or buy a certain thing. Oftentimes it, of course, is to inform us, and there are plenty of good, credible, popular sources. But in the world of popular sources, you're just as likely to be entertained as you are to be informed, and that's not really the case with scholarly sources. You won't find them particularly entertaining, but they will be very informative and useful for the types of research that you're doing. Indicators like how it reads or sounds. A scholarly source is very jargon heavy. There are going to be a lot of words that you'll find challenging and things you've never heard of and things you'll have to look up, frankly. But luckily, we have access to plenty of good, helpful things like Google and online dictionaries and encyclopedias. The tone is very formal. But in a popular source, it could really run the gamut. It could be the tone could be emotional or humorous, engaging, entertaining, and it could read like someone speaking to you, so that it's very informal sounding. How it looks, well, a scholarly source is likely to be pretty bland, black and white, all business information, charts, graphs, tables, no distractions, and typically no ads. But as we know, in the world of popular sources, I'm speaking specifically of internet sources, there's just things flashing at us from the periphery all the time, colorful advertisements and little videos, all kinds of distractions, really, right? And things are sort of meant to push us elsewhere in the internet so that, advertisers get their clicks, and you read more and more articles within the same website. And that's how I assume these things make their money. And last but not least, how you found it is a kind of an indicator too. Your popular sources, of our favorite way, of course, is our favorite search engine, which tends to be Google, right? But a lot of the things we encounter in other areas as well, whether we're watching TV and the news comes on, or pumping gas at the gas station, and we're getting hit with advertisements from the gas pump. We're just being bombarded with information. And so popular sources abound, right? But scholarly sources, not so much. We have to take specific channels to actually get to a scholarly source. And your specific route to scholarly sources is through our library homepage. So what you're looking at now is a very tiny version of what our library homepage looks like. Could I blow that up just for a second? I'm likely to lose a little bit on the edges here. But if you see here, at our library homepage, there's this thing called the single search. And the single search is really your gateway to the world of scholarly sources. So I'm going to do a quick search for something like, let's just say one of my favorite literary figures, Thomas Wolfe. Uh-oh. So I'm going to resize that and try to pull that into your view. When you do your search, you're going to need to have your library barcode number, which you'll need to pick up at Irwin Library on the 3rd floor of WLC, or you can order it online and they'll mail it to you. Of course, that'll take a little bit longer. It would be much quicker if you could just go there yourself. I'm going to punch mine in real quick. There we go. That's a long number to memorize, but it happens after you enter it a bajillion times. So what you're looking at here is our Irwin Library online databases. And I'm going again to resize just a bit so you can see a little bit more of it. I'm going to do a separate video to try to introduce you to this. But this is, other than going physically to the library and finding what scholarly books they have there in the shelves, this is probably going to be your go-to for when you're asked to write a research paper in college. You're going to go to your library homepage and do the one search in the case of ours, and this is how you'll find scholarly sources. So let me blow this back up, and I'll just show you here on the left-hand toolbar. There are a lot of things you can do to limit the search results that you receive. And one important one here is this one, scholarly peer-reviewed. So if I check this box, the screen's going to turn gray, and I lost many thousands of hits now, and presumably I have been left with only scholarly sources. So that's a quick way to get to the world of scholarly sources. And I think I should probably create a video that's just specifically about the databases, so that's probably to come. But for a moment, I just want to glance back at our rhetoric notes one last time, and I wanted to touch back on something from the previous video. This business here about primary and secondary sources. That's not too difficult to understand. Let me put it to you this way. A primary source varies from discipline to discipline. So a primary text, in the case of, let's just say, literature, a literature course, a primary text would be the art or the thing being studied. For example, Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven would be a primary source. It's the thing itself that's being studied, and that is primary. But if I found a scholarly paper about that particular poem, well, that is kind of a secondary source, because it is once removed from the primary. If we want to think of it in another context, let's think about a history class. Well, a history class, let's say someone found a bundle of letters that a Civil War soldier had sent back home while he was out on the battlefield. Well, this bundle of letters is a historical artifact, and it is written, having been written from someone who lived during that time, it exists as a primary source for what history was like, that historical moment was like. But let's just say someone accumulates all these letters from one soldier from one side of the war, and then a bunch of letters from a soldier from the other side of the war, and now we have a fuller picture of what that battle or what those everyday life circumstances were like for these soldiers. And that historian would have to do a little bit of synthesizing and pulling things together. So he used primary sources, but the book he wrote that he gleaned from gathering these letters would be a secondary source, which is kind of like a biography would be a secondary source. And of course, an autobiography, written by the person, his or herself, himself or herself, that would be a primary source. In another context, I think about the sciences. Well, if someone did an experiment in a lab, let's just say with bacteria on a petri dish, and then they wrote a lab report about what they did and what their results were, well, that would be the primary source. But if someone writing a literature review gathered all the papers everyone had published on this particular bacteria and wrote a kind of synopsis that sort of pulled all those together and said, here's what everyone's found so far, well, that literature review is a secondary source because it's once removed from those primary sources.